And within the North Carolina delegation, no surprises on these votes, strictly a party line vote. Democrats in support of these two articles, Republicans opposed. They cannot use their cell phones or electronic devices during the trial. We're talking about probably 6 days a week, several hours on the Senate floor hearing arguments, not being able to check your cell phone. They would have to be kind of locked away in a separate room. The other thing that's kind of stood out to me is that members should refrain from speaking to neighboring senators while the case is being presented. So basically, you can't look at your phone, you can't talk to people around you. It says don't look at documents that have nothing to do with the trial. The Senate has now formally invited, there's a lot of procedure here, formally invited the House back to read the articles of impeachment. They're going to so-called exhibit those articles. So they are walking, is what I'm being told right now. So you can watch that as it plays out. And then after those are read, around 2 o'clock is when the next stage of this takes place. That's when Chief Justice John Roberts from the Supreme Court comes over to the Senate chamber. He will be presiding during this trial. He will be sworn in, and then he will swear in the senators. They will be serving as the jurors as to whether or not the president should be removed from office. So that is really the game plan today. After that, they'll send a summons to the White House, basically formally telling him that you have now been impeached and now you have the chance to respond to this as part of the trial. And then things will really get underway next week. So basically, that's the end for today. On Tuesday is when we expect the real trial to really get underway. We'll hear from both the prosecutors, who are the House floor managers that we met yesterday, and then from the White House. And then from there, it's a question as to how all of this will play out. There is the question of witnesses. Will witnesses be called, such as John Bolton, such as Hunter Biden? There seems to be some negotiations behind the scenes about what exactly could be some sort of trade-off for witnesses. And then there's the question of the timeline. Could this take 2 weeks? The White House certainly wants to get this wrapped up as quickly as possible, or could it stretch into February? We just don't know at this point, Tim.
Yeah, and again, if you're just joining us, as House managers were walking through, as Kevin mentioned, presenting those impeachment articles, Jerry Nadler and Adam Schiff at the front there. Kevin, what are we hearing, if anything, from North Carolina lawmakers today?
Right. So we of course know that two of our North Carolina lawmakers, both Senator Richard Burr and Tom Tillis, will be serving as jurors effective just about 2 hours from now in this trial. I had a chance to talk with Senator Tillis recently, and if you remember I believe it was about a month or so ago, he came out and said that I'm a definite no on removing the president, with the asterisk that if there is some new evidence that comes forward, all of a sudden maybe he would reconsider, but that's a big if. I had a chance to ask him again to follow up just recently. Are you still a definite no? He said yes. He also said this.
You look at one of the articles of impeachment is contempt of Congress because the president asserted privilege. If that alone is a basis for removal, then every president in the history of the United States could be subject to removal.
So you're hearing from him there on, again, that was one of the articles, which is obstruction of Congress. The other one, abuse of power, is the more, shall we say, broad-spanning one. That deals more specifically with this alleged campaign to try to get Ukraine to dig up dirt and investigate the Bidens in exchange for this military aid. But now there's going to be undoubtedly a lot of acrimony after today. And so although this is a very important day, a very historic day, the division in Washington is by no means going to be erased by the magnitude of what is happening, Tim. The White House announced last evening that a handful of President Trump's biggest offenders in the House are part of his, quote, impeachment team, that they'll kind of help underline the defense. Likely this means that they will be doing lots of television appearances, basically continuing to promote the White House's perspective on this trial outside of the confines of the trial itself, because there was some debate about whether or not to allow them to be part of the defending the president on the Senate floor. That was something that Majority Leader Mitch McConnell did not seem inclined to want, believing it would turn this whole trial into a circus. And the president's team spent 2 of the 24 hours they're allotted to make their case, and really the thrust of it came at the very beginning. One of the lawyers saying that the president did absolutely nothing wrong. Now, as we get a little more into the weeds of their argument, they contend that that call the president had with the president of Ukraine was, quote, perfect, saying the president was concerned about burden sharing and corruption in that country. They say that there was no quid pro quo, which is something we've heard the president repeat multiple times in recent weeks, and they labeled the impeachment push as purely political.
They're asking you not only to overturn the results of the last election, but as I've said before, they're asking you to remove President Trump from the ballot in an election that's occurring in approximately 9 months.
Of course, in their 3 days of arguments, Democrats argued that that call was by no means perfect. And if you look at the larger scenario, the president, they say, was acting politically, asking for that investigation into the Bidens. Joe Biden, of course, a potential formidable candidate against the president heading into 2020. Now, the lawyers indicated that today was going to be more or less their opening salvo, a preview of coming attractions, and they will get to pick back up on Monday and Tuesday to continue making their case, Vivian.
And President Trump has, of course, tweeted. Do you have more details of what his sentiments were as this first day of his opening arguments were made?
Right, Vivian. He tweeted throughout the morning, including quoting some Fox News personalities. And at one point, right before the trial started at 10 a.m., he tweeted out saying that our case against Lyon, Sheehan, Little, Adam Shifty Schiff, Cryan, Chuck Schumer, Nervous Nancy Pelosi, the leader, dumb as a rock, AOC, and so forth, starts at 10 a.m. Previously, earlier this week, the president indicated that he believes Saturday to be the Death Valley of television. So based on this tweet, he was essentially serving as kind of a television tease, hoping that people will tune in and juice the ratings. But we had a chance to ask him directly, does he support additional witnesses? He does not. I followed up asking about that New York Times article and the question of John Bolton, the former national security advisor, who apparently in his forthcoming book will allege that there was a quid pro quo, that the president was asking for those investigations in exchange for the military aid. Would he want to hear from him? Why not hear from him? Here's part of that exchange. Explain to me why you shouldn't hear what he has to say if he says there's information.
Explain to me why they didn't go through the process of subpoenaing him, challenging privilege if it was asserted, coming up with an accommodation, all the things that the Founding Fathers envisioned and that are in the Constitution, and rights and privileges that the House chose not to exercise.
Are you curious what he would say?
Look, you're always curious what anybody would say, and I'd be very curious as to why they didn't take the time to do the work in the House.
So as you heard, there's something we've heard from Republicans a lot in the past couple of days, which is basically saying this investigation should have happened over in the House. We on the Senate side shouldn't be furthering this investigation. Of course, I spoke with Congressman David Price yesterday, and he pointed out that, look, the White House stonewalled hearing from a lot of these witnesses and getting these certain documents, and that interfered in our ability to fill in some of these blanks. And their argument essentially is if we had to wait additional months, additional weeks to get those materials, that would get us way too close to the election, which is what they're trying, the Democrats argue, to protect.
We're talking about 4 or 5 amendments tonight. Those have taken 2 hours each in the past, but I'm hearing they also trying to want to get out by 9 tonight. So is this compressed potentially?
Yeah, I mean, the sense is that they want to be out between 9 and 10, and then they'll be gone for the weekend. This is good news for those Democrats that want to run, or that are running in the Iowa caucuses, of course, because they would like to be on the ground, shaking hands, kissing babies, doing the things that you need to do on the campaign trail, especially folks like Bernie Sanders, Amy Klobuchar, Elizabeth Warren, who just haven't had that time because of the trial. They've been here while Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg have basically free reign across Iowa. Well, Tim, it's a day of tradition, of course, and we expect all of the pomp and circumstance that comes with that. But as you mentioned at the top, this is a bit of an oddball year in the fact that the president is currently going through an impeachment trial. And although we do expect the acquittal coming tomorrow, this at least sets the stage for kind of a different dynamic within the chamber, that you have House lawmakers that voted to impeach him and then members of the Senate that are currently considering his fate. Those are the folks he'll be speaking to. Now, the question that we are kind of considering or will be watching for tonight is, will he bring up impeachment at all throughout the course of this speech? An aide to the White House suggested to reporters there earlier today that impeachment is not going to be mentioned, but of course he also mentioned that things could change. So I had a chance to ask our lawmakers whether they think they should be bringing up, or excuse me, the president should bring up impeachment as part of this speech. Jerry Nadler, who is in charge of the Judiciary Committee over on the House side, suggested today that they may pull in John Bolton, who of course was the former national security advisor, the one who's writing this book that we expect to come out in a few months, and that New York Times article suggested that he basically says in this book that the president tied the aid to Ukraine to these investigations into the Biden. In short, that quid pro quo that Democrats argue is there to be seen, and thus that abuse of power. So the question is, could we see him testify before a panel sometime in the next few weeks, next few months? That's an open question. There's also a kind of quiet, though it's yet to really pick up a great deal of traction, push for censuring the president, which would be basically more of a slap on the wrist versus actually removing him from office, basically condemning the actions of the president. As you've heard from some Republicans, like Lamar Alexander, they're uncomfortable. They think it was irresponsible how the president acted, so there might be some more Republican buy-in there. Tom Tillis, a Republican up for re-election this year, his campaign account sending out a tweet basically mocking Nancy Pelosi. Take a look at it. If you remember last night at the end of the State of the Union, she ripped up the speech that the president delivered. And in this case, if you see this video, Tillis is ripping up the articles of impeachment. So obviously this video prepared ahead of time, released just briefly after those votes were cast. Now, obviously Tillis sees some electoral benefit in this. He released a digital ad, his campaign did earlier today, also going after basically the impeachment process, saying North Carolinians are tired of this. I've been talking to lawmakers from the North Carolina delegation, and it depends on really who you talk to whether or not they believe impeachment will have any electoral benefit by the time we get to November. Congressman Mark Walker suggesting this will probably almost all be forgotten because the news cycle moves so quickly.
Sort of an anticlimactic end to this trial in a lot of ways.
In many ways, Tim, because this is kind of the inevitable conclusion we saw coming, several weeks ago at this point. At the end of the day, a largely party line vote with one exception, and maybe that was the one bit of drama that we saw today. Senator Mitt Romney of Utah announcing that he would be voting to convict the president on one of the two articles, on abuse of power. He is a Republican, meaning that there was a Republican joining with Democrats in voting to remove the president. Obviously, this is not enough to get them to the 2/3 vote that they would need, but it did at least provide a little bit of a shaking on the ground here earlier today. Here's a little of what Mitt Romney said while he was speaking about his decision on the Senate floor, at one point choking up.
With my vote, I will tell my children and their children that I did my duty to the best of my ability, believing that my country expected it of me. I will only be one name among many, no more, no less, to future generations of Americans who look at the record of this trial. They will note merely that I was among the senators who determined that what the president did was wrong, grievously wrong.
So a little bit more on the impact of this. When you look at the actual vote totals, all the Democrats ended up sticking together, even some of those that are in vulnerable positions. Consider Doug Jones of Alabama, a Democrat in a red state. He also voted to convict. Only Mitt Romney was the one that crossed those lines. And also, this denies the White House and Republicans the talking point that this was a purely partisan vote to convict, because a Republican joined with the Democrats, albeit if you want to talk about bipartisanship, this is about as close to not bipartisanship as you can ultimately get at the end of the day. Romney already facing pushback, including from the press secretary at the White House, saying that he is a failed Republican presidential candidate, and expect the president to weigh in on this as well, inevitably, Tim.
Yeah, no question. That's predictable. Also predictable how North Carolina senators were going to vote. And we're hearing a little bit more from Richard Burr tonight.
Indeed. So we knew kind of going into this that both of our Republican senators, both Richard Burr and Tom Tillis, would vote no on these articles, and they did do that. Burr had suggested in a radio interview last week that he agreed with the White House lawyer Alan Dershowitz that basically the allegations against the president, even if true, did not rise to the level of removing the president. He then today, in a statement after the vote, took an attack on the process that the House investigators used, saying in that statement, investigators followed an arbitrary, self-imposed timeline dictated by political rather than substantive concerns. When due process threatened to slow down the march forward, they took shortcuts. This seemingly an attack on the fact that they didn't follow through on a subpoena with John Bolton, that former national security advisor, that in that new book that is forthcoming, according to the New York Times, he will link the aid to Ukraine to those investigations into the Biden, saying that the president basically made that link. There was also argument that the House did not fully complete the investigation, that they were asking the Senate to complete some of that further investigating with those documents and witnesses. All
right, Kevin, so what now in terms of Congress, right? So we have an election obviously up next, so one wonders if anything we could done anyways, but can these folks work together? We saw Nancy Pelosi ripping the script last night, and can these folks get anything done?
Right. It's hard to really say, Tim. There was a suggestion when I talked to lawmakers last night around the State of the Union that, maybe we could talk about infrastructure. Well, they've been talking about doing something big on infrastructure since the beginning of the Trump presidency, and none of that has really come to fruition. As you noted, this is an election year. So on top of the fact that they are now bitterly divided because of impeachment, you then have the fact that we're now going to be going completely into our own corners as we head into Election Day. We know that President Donald Trump's going to be having a press conference, or at least some sort of spoken announcement tomorrow around noon, reacting to impeachment, so that will likely only fire up both sides of the aisle as well. And then there's the chance that there could be a continuing investigation. Maybe the House lawmakers will decide to pull in John Bolton to have testimony from him. They could try to do that on the House side since the Senate chose not to. That is still not clear, though one House lawmaker, Jerry Nadler of New York, suggested they may just do that. So this could continue. This rancorous investigation could continue, that continues to divide lawmakers here on Capitol Hill. So whether or not we'll see anything legislatively progressing in the next couple months, That is hard to tell, but it's highly unlikely if you want my honest opinion.
Yep, I think you're probably right on that. Unfortunately, I think a lot of American people like to see things get done. Kevin Frey, great work as always. We appreciate your help.